Good morning, everyone. Um, so again, Vice Dean Ima Clemente, Head of the Department of uh, Personality, Psychological Assessment and Psychological Treatment. Uh, Ladies and gentlemen, I'm here to officially welcome you all to the 2013, to the 2013 uh, biannual meeting of the International Society for the Study of Individual Differences. So I hope you all will enjoy this wonderful city by the Mediterranean, which is a crossroad of cultures and cradle of the Catalan people. And I hope too that you will enjoy this world-class venue in which we're holding this conference. So, hola y benvinguts a Barcelona. Um, this is the second time that the Issid travels to Spain, and here I'd like to have some special words for Dr. Luis Garcia Sevilla. The oldest in the Issid will likely remind of him. He was the organizer of the second Issid meeting in Sant Feliu de Guíxols, up to the north in Catalonia. And I humbly think that he deserved a honored place among differentialist psychologists in this corner of the Mediterranean. As a young psychologist, when I got the degree of psychology, I had the chance to discover Ising's giant 3 model, thanks to him working as a junior psychologist by his side. In fact, he is allegedly guilty for pushing too many people to the study of individual difference here. And I don't want to cite anybody, but there's many people in the room that is devoted to individual differences, likely because of him. Seriously, I don't want to mention anybody because I take the risk to miss too many people. Uh, Although he hasn't been able to attend the conference, I just want to tell him thank you very much, Luis, for being a pioneer and encouraging generations of young scholars to the study of individual differences. Moltes gràcies per tot, Luis. Um, before further proceeding, I would like to acknowledge our sponsors, especially the Department of Finances and Universities of the Catalan government, for their support through an ARCS grant. I'd also like to acknowledge the University of Barcelona, and especially the Faculty of Psychology and the Department of Personality, Psychological Treatment, and Psychological Assessment of the university especially for their encouragement and for their support in terms of material and human resources. Elsevier also deserves a special mention, but I'll do it later on. And finally, the Ibero-American Association for the Study of Individual Differences, represented here by Maria Ángeles Quiroga, who's the president. Pearson, Hogan, and TIA Ediciones have generously contributed to this meeting, so just let us acknowledge them for their support. But let's talk about the contents of the conference. First, I'm just going to give a broad landscape of the conference. So first, the various symposia and parallel sessions that have been organized for the next 4 days promise exciting revelations for all who attend them. So I encourage you to attend all of the conferences. Its symposium, which consists of 4 to 6 panelists who are experts in their respective fields. Its symposium will consist of that. Topics in this conference will range from very basic issues such as assessment or personality structure to biological underpinnings of key individual differences such as intelligence or personality dimensions and so forth. We will also focus on applied settings in which individual differences are quite important, such as health or educational settings or even job settings. I mean, it's going to be, I guess, and I expect that it's going to be a wonderful conference. So, hence, you might learn more about the topic with which you were already familiar, or you might also find yourself discovering a whole new world of ideas and information that you didn't know that it exists. So either way, you'll have many opportunities to explore fascinating new terrains with these reputable speakers that are among us. Second, the keynote addresses. They will provide for all of us an important window into the world of the future in individual differences. We are privileged to have as our keynote speakers both Bob Kruger and Roberto Colom. While the latter is widely regarded as a world-leading expert in the biological basis of intelligence, the former is widely reputed for his expertise on personality development, behavioral genetics, and personality disorders. Kruger's address will bring us to the implications of the recently published DSM-5 and its interplay with personality psychology. Rob Colom will snap a picture of intelligence in this amazing talk entitled From the Earth to the Brain. So both keynotes will take place in this same room on Tuesday and Thursday right after lunch. Additionally, I don't want you to miss the different awards lectures, including the Ising Award, delivered by an old friend, Bill Revell, and the Early Career Awards that this year have been awarded to Sophie von Stum and Christian Candler. So I encourage you again to attend these wonderful lectures. And third, here comes some practical information. Throughout the conference, you are invited to visit and explore the Museum of Science. Given that the ticket that you've been provided, so this is something like this with a barcode, allows you to access it for free. It's a day pass ticket, so you can go in and out again, and explore the fascinating world of science in general, from microbia or microbial life to physics or geology or whatever you want. I mean, there's a whole world of possibilities here. It's worth a visit. You'll be able to find out the life of bacteria, dinosaurs, or even explore the life in a tropical rainforest right by the corner. So you will even notice the mist in your skin. So this is just for wearing your badge and waving your ticket. So what else? Additionally, if you have not done yet, and especially if you are a young scholar, I'd like to encourage you to join. The workshop, the authoring workshop that will take place here tomorrow morning. This amazing workshop will be delivered by Tony Vernon and Irene Kanter-Schilfke from Elsevier, and it's especially intended for newbies in publishing, but also for senior authors. So thanks again to Elsevier for their support in organizing this workshop. Finally, as you attend these various events, and this is just a cautionary note, as you attend these various events, keep in mind that other people can also serve as doorways to new worlds. So hearing of someone else's background and experiences can often make for fascinating discoveries that can educate and profoundly affect us. So take advantage, take the opportunity of this rare gathering of hundreds of people or dozens of people working in the same field to meet another, talk with another, talk with one another, and learn from one another. After attending dozens of conferences by myself, one realizes that this is what makes the difference from a good conference to a good one. So it's not only a matter of contents. It's a matter of networking. It's a matter of getting connected with people. So that's what make a difference. That was make a difference between a good conference and a bad conference. So all in all, should you have further questions, don't hesitate to stop by the conference secretariat, which is located in -1 floor, right upstairs, or come up to any of the guys with blue T-shirts or even myself. So feel free to stop me and came up to me and ask for whatever you want. So we will do our very best to make your stay in Barcelona as pleasant as possible. I wouldn't like to finish without acknowledging everyone who has worked together with me, from people on the Ibero-American Association, Don Saklovke, Frank Spinath, to people in the local committee, such as Monsan Jornet, Carlos Uso, Laura Cecilia, and dozens of volunteers that are volunteering and helping me in this endeavor. In conclusion, I welcome you once again to our 15th biannual meeting. So it's the 13th anniversary of the Issid, I guess. So now, just to quote a great explorer, it's time for you to boldly go where no man has gone before, to explore strange new worlds. So enjoy the journey to the world of individual differences. Thank you. So now, María Ángeles Quiroga will give a brief foreword. So.
Good morning, everybody. As you know, this is the second time ISSID comes to Spain. It's for us a great pleasure, of course. Psychology of individual differences enjoys a very long tradition here in Spain. Coming back to Juan Huarte de San Juan, many of you know about him. And till now, since the beginning of the journal, for example, the Personality and Individual Differences Journal, in 1980, researchers from Spain have published more than 250 papers. So we feel proud of it. These numbers could be no very important for you, but if I told you that only 3 countries have published a large amount of papers, it sounds important for a small country as the ours. So in 2010, this society, the Latin American Society for the Research on Individual Differences, started following the Spanish Society. We are a small society. We are no more than 35 members, but all of us are very committed with the personality and individual differences. I'm sure you will find this conference very stimulating, both from a professional but also from a personal perspective. And I just want to say you welcome, benvinguts, bienvenidos, but also I will thank David. We feel very proud of you, David. Thank you.
Welcome.
And now Don Sakowski, as president of the ISSID, will tell you some words. Thank you.
Morning, buen dia. It's wonderful to be back in Spain and to see many familiar faces, and particularly to see some new faces that have joined us at this conference, and hopefully will continue to be with us as members of Issid or even of the Spanish Society if you are a local. One of the things that we would like to do right off the bat, or what I'd like to do right off the bat, is to welcome you to what is the 16th Conference of the International Society for the Study of Individual Differences. And I think you've heard from David and others that this is in fact our 30th anniversary. So it is a very special occasion in many, many ways. Many societies come and go, some thrive, some struggle on. I think Issid has done a remarkable job of promoting the study of individual differences, not only through Europe, but as we've discovered with our conferences through Australia, Europe, Eastern Europe as well, and I should suspect in probably the very near future, we'll start to see more of a presence in Southeast Asia as well, and all of Asia. I want to add my special thanks to David. I cannot believe that one person and a small elite team of helpers and supporters, and with the support of his academy, have been able to so remarkably pull off a conference like this. I arrived yesterday, met with David. We came over, Frank and David and myself, to look at the venue here, and absolutely Barcelona strikes again with a number one. I don't think I've seen a museum as comprehensive and incredibly beautiful as this one, from the botanical forest to the interactive museums and so forth. So really it is a bit of heaven on earth in Barcelona. And with David's wonderful work, this conference has already shown itself to be a most successful one. So David, thank you. Thank you to all of your people who have worked with you. And I'd also like to add thanks especially to Frank and the directors of Issid for all of the work that they've done behind the scenes to support this, and also the sponsors that David has mentioned. We do know again that it's the 30th kind of year of Issid, and it did start in London, England in 1983. I put a little bit of a welcome in your folder in the program, and I should always, before I do things like that, consult with Bob Stelmack, who is our archivist and historian and knows everything that there is to know about Issid. So for those of you who haven't got the history, do catch Bob on the side. He will tell you all and everything. None of the dark secrets, but or things like that, but he will certainly tell you a lot about the association. And what I think it probably is fitting to do before I say anything further is to recognize the Issid founders. Now, while there's many, many people, there's always some that really come to the forefront, and that includes people like Ernie Barrett, of course, Professor Hans Eysenck, Sybil Eysenck, Irene Martin, Daisy Schelling, Bob Stelmack, Jan Strola, Glenn Wilson, and Marvin Zuckerman. These are the people that are kind of behind the scenes of that very first meeting, which we held in London, England. There we are. For those of us who are still here today, didn't we look so young and handsome and beautiful? But you'll see in the front row Marvin Zuckerman, Professor Eysenck, and Bob Stelmack. And for those of you who have been around for a while, lots of younger faces in there, including some that were way in the background there, some aspiring presidents to be, Bill Revell, Adrian Furnham. I know I'm in there somewhere, but I'm not going to point you out because I was having a bad hair day. So I think this is what we looked like 30 years ago. And it's remarkable to see how far we have come. So I've been asked to do, as president, an address. And this is probably, for me, one of the most uncomfortable moments. I lecture at universities. I do a number of presentations. I love presenting at Issid meetings. I'm not so good at standing up in front of a large audience as this and presenting. But what I thought I would do is to share with you some work that I've done, which is a bit oblique to probably much of what many of us normally do. Much of my work is still involved, certainly in the personality area and individual differences, biological bases, and so forth. But over the last number of years, I've been involved in departments of psychology, which have caused me to keep a foot in both camps. And that is the camp of science, basic science, and also the professional side, the training of psychologists who work in schools, clinics, hospitals, and so forth. And so it's that kind of scientist practitioner side that suggested to me anyways that I should probably share a little bit of that with you, and to survey and overview some of the work that I've been fortunate enough to be involved in. I don't take really a great deal of credit for any of this work. I share it with my colleagues who, much like coming to an Issid meeting, I always find able to stimulate me beyond boundaries that I never knew were possible. So I want to talk a bit about the influences of culture and social context on intelligence. You know, there's a number of questions that over the years, as one of my research thrusts that I've addressed, and that is, you know, the basic question of intelligence itself, the fundamental question of what is it, where does it reside, is there really a kind of genetic basis for intelligence, is there more of an environmental basis, do we have a single gene, is it polygenic? And the question of the structure of intelligence itself. There's many people in this audience here that are addressing the same question. And the question is one not only of the structure of intelligence, but how robust it is. Is it unique? Is it idiosyncratic? Is it universal? The other thing, too, is that as we develop, as psychologists, ways of measuring intelligence, because unless we can measure the things that we study, we're going to have a very hard time describing them. It's one of the cornerstones of science, is how well do these intelligence tests travel. And we've seen all sorts of controversy over the last number of years about bias in tests. This is particularly something that comes out of the literature in the United States, questions and accusations of bias and unfairness built into tests. So the question becomes one of not only is intelligence universal, but do the ways that we measure it travel well? What are the kind and extent of similarities between and differences between countries and cultures on intelligence tests, to answer the above questions? And again, one of the things that we know is that while genetics and biology, if you wish, may explain much of the variance in intelligence, what are some of the key external factors that account for some of these differences? And these are not only group differences, but individual differences. One thing that I always say when I'm working with psychologists who are going to be practitioners is that after you've given all of your tests, don't forget about the individual that is there. Why is it that 100 kids, all with a measured intelligence of 100, are still 100 very unique and individual kids? What is it that makes them different from all others? And I think one of the other things that I was going to talk about, but because we decided to start a little bit late to give people time to settle in, and because I'm not going to go over time, I've only brought 450 slides with me today, so I'll try to get it all in the next 30 minutes. But I'm going to not talk about something that I thought would be rather interesting, and that would be to compare, at this point, the views of intelligence as seen by psychologists, particularly as we've seen the growth of psychology and the study of individual differences in Asia. I've had the good fortune of traveling to China for about the last 15, 20 years, and I've watched a country absolutely explode in its evolution. I can remember 20 years ago giving a lecture in Japan on individual differences and intelligence, and the audience was extremely polite and had absolutely no interest in anything that I was saying because it wasn't part of the way that they viewed human beings, so to speak. So now it's changed, and I keep going back to China, and the topic that they're interested in there and also in Japan is the study of intelligence, the study of individual differences, where personality fits into that, the models of personality. The work of many of you in here are things that are of particular interest to them. So I think by way of a wee bit of an outline, just a few things I'm going to talk about are some studies that we've done over time. Most of this stuff has been published. I'll bring in a bit of new data here today, but one of the very first things to look at is the question of the robustness of intelligence and how we measure it across countries. I'm not going to spend a great deal of time looking at the psychometrics and how we adapt intelligence tests and so forth, but just to share with you some findings from some rather large data sets. Many of us as psychologists have realized that not only when we come to meetings like this, do we learn so much by our discussions and our interactions with others, but also as researchers. There's massive databases out there. All one needs to do is to speak to Ian Deary, and he will tell you, just go down in the basement of any old building, and there's probably boxes of data all over the place that you can go back and 60, 70 years. And of course, if it's Scotland, people don't travel usually that far, so you can follow up and do some longitudinal studies. But there are many, many huge databases out there, and I've been fortunate to draw from these, and that will be reflected in all of these talks, and particularly the first one. What we're also going to do today, hopefully, is to take a little bit of a look at some group comparisons in the United States. I'm not using United States as an example of anything other than it's a natural laboratory to study some of the things that we'll talk about today, and look at some of these external factors, if you wish, some of these exogenous factors such as home factors, parental expectation, and so forth on intelligence differences in children. And then to move that up a notch and to move from a look at children's intelligence into adult intelligence. And as I say, we'll probably forgo the latter part. I have to acknowledge all of my colleagues in this. The list is actually extensive. These are some of the people that I've worked with very directly on this research. And one group that I would be remiss not to thank, and some of them are actually here in the audience, are my graduate students who always stimulate me to think beyond the box, and who always pose questions that are not only much more interesting and intriguing that I could pose, but are also the kinds of complexities that keep me from manifesting early onset dementia. So I thank my students very, very much for that. Some of the material that I'll talk about today has been published in a variety of books, and again, I have to thank people who have been very supportive of this. Elsevier Academic Press have been excellent publishers to work with. So I think the very first thing that we want to look at is the construct of intelligence and its measurement equivalence, across groups, across cultures, countries, and so forth. And starting off with a statement, the famous Cluckholm statement is that, how we're alike, all others, some others, and no others. I think this is a fundamental question that drives most of our work. And one of the complexities of course, working in the area of intelligence is that there's many, many different ways of studying it. You can study it from the perspective of the, kind of the individual gene, if you wish, from the perspective of neurotransmitters. You can look at it from the variety of external factors, such as we'll be talking about today. But there's also multiple models out there that account for it. So while since the time of Galton, and certainly long before, intelligence has been in the forefront of psychology, and we can track this all the way through McKean-Cattell, into Thorndike, up to David Wexler, right up into all the contemporary people, the Sternbergs, Nagliaris, and many, many others. Intelligence has a number of different models that drive it. The one that I'm going to use today is a model that, of course, began with David Wexler. And while some might not call it a model, but an accidental factor analytic kind of finding, we'll go with that because, in fact, many of these things that are coming out in the Wexler scales now are starting to map very much onto what we call CHC theory, the Cattell-Horn kind of work. There's lots of tests out there as well. We could use any one of the tests, I guess, to do the kind of research that we're doing. But once again, there's two reasons for using the Wexlers. It's a wonderful database to access, and probably one of the measures that's been more carefully standardized, not only in North America, but throughout the world, in contrast to other tests. But it's also one also that I have access to because I do a lot of consulting with it's now Pearson, it's no longer Psychological Corporation, on the development of their tests and models and so forth. So there are other models out there. I'm not making a kind of a pretense at supporting any one particular viewpoint, but this one does seem to work really well. So the question is, if we take some of these data out there, do the Wexler tests measure the same constructs across cultures? I had the good fortune a few years ago of accessing a database on the Wexlers along with Jim Jorgis and Fons van de Vieve and Larry Weiss that looked at the standardization of the previous version of the Wexler tests for children, the WISC-3. And massive standardization studies have been carried out in many, many countries, but there were 16 that kind of met our criteria of having sufficient data and being very, very carefully standardized in terms of the kind of population demographics and so forth. You could go through this and say that, the subjects were very carefully selected to be included in standardization based on things such as sex, based on region of the country, socioeconomic status, and a number of other factors. So this is the group that we'll be looking at. Of course, the test itself was initially created in the United States, and there's a bit of a history of creating tests in the United States and then simply translating them and exporting them to other countries. And we know darn well that doesn't work. It didn't work even in Canada, where we used to bring these tests up simply across the border and discovered that there were items in there such as name 2 presidents of the United States. And yes, it could work in Canada, but would it give you the same scores? Would it start to kind of introduce a bit of a bias? And of course, until you actually study these things properly, it's very easy just to simply say, well, we'll scratch that item out and put in name 2 prime ministers of Canada. Or in the case of how far is it from New York to Paris, we'll just change that, and how far is it from Toronto to Calgary? These are just arbitrary changes, and yet then we go back and use the same norms that the Americans are using to try to figure out what a standard score is on these tests. So these tests now have gone through massive standardization, and that includes adapting these tests. So I'd just like to show you that it's not just a question of taking a test and translating it, but how much care has gone into these tests. So if we take the kind of the so-called more crystallized side of intelligence, and we look at moving these tests that were developed in the States into other countries, we can see that especially for the so-called verbal IQ or crystallized side of things, that in some countries there was a large number of item changes, and this is based on experts in that country, a considerable amount of effort to test these things out, do some beta testing and so forth. What's interesting is if you move more to the kind of fluid side, the number of changes are quite a bit fewer. And why these changes in Japan, we don't know. This was something that the Japanese insisted they had to do, and yet we saw very, very few changes taking place in any other country. These items could just simply be moved over, and maybe the instructions modified a wee bit, but anyways, that's the way the test worked. So what we found is that, again, most of the items did not change on the performance test, certainly many more on the verbal test. What happens is when you throw all of these data into, again, kind of a good look, statistical look, what we found is that essentially we get this one large first factor, and looking at both eigenvalues and so forth, we find that there's about 3 to 4 factors there that really have eigenvalues above 1, and of course the scree test probably suggests more like 2. So what's interesting here as we look across all of these different countries is that this thing called G, which has been under some assault, and why I don't know. I mean, I know we're looking for a general personality factor these days, but I find G, because it's been around for a long time, to be a very, very useful construct. Now, in clinical work, yeah, again, you can have 100 kids all with an IQ of 100, and yet they're still very different kids. But that IQ of 100 in the first place kind of gives you a ballpark to start to work from. So what we find here is that as we go across all of these countries, we get a very robust general factor. Yes, was the test created to give you a general factor? Maybe, maybe not. I mean, other tests, for example, aren't quite as clear on that first general factor, but even things like the PASS model, Luria's PASS model, which has been translated into the cognitive assessment system, in spite of that, still gives you kind of an omnibus G factor. The Woodcock-Johnson, based on the Horn-Carroll-Cattell model, has an overarching second-order G factor. So it just comes through. As you start to measure more cognitively complex kinds of things, G is going to come through because of shared variance. Maybe Galton didn't find that, but then again, when you have strength of grip and pitch discrimination and, memory for words or numbers, yeah, I can see that maybe separating, but not in these kinds of tests. Also, what's really interesting is that if we look at the first 2 factors, that kind of, I'm not going to call it fluid crystallized so much, I'll call it just simply verbal performance based on Wechsler himself. I mean, you get 2 very, very clear factors coming out there. It's a very nice split, and it's robust across the countries. We also can find a 3-factor solution, which again is very, very clear as we pool our data. And it's suggesting that there's the verbal performance kind of, or fluid crystallized kind of factor, but also another factor that seems to be tapping into something that is now kind of morphed off into the newer versions of this test, which we call basically kind of a processing speed thing. And that happens as a function of parsing out or pulling out speed from these other cognitively complex kinds of things and pulling out and measuring it separately. We know speed of processing is fundamentally important to intelligence, the speed of processing information, neural efficiency. In fact, we actually call it the cognitive proficiency index, now, but we can parse that out and kind of put it on its own. And if we go a little bit further, what we find is that we can actually pull out another factor in there and separate it from this larger verbal performance and G-based thing. And this is called, kind of they used to call it freedom from distractibility. I have no idea what that means, but it's really a working memory factor. And because it's come out and because it's very much a part of CHC theory and so forth, and any psychologist working in everyday practice will tell you that working memory is a cornerstone of cognitive ability. So it's now not only come out and is able to be measured, but what we've done is we've enhanced it in more recent measures. So what we're getting is that if we look across the various countries and so forth, we find that the factor solutions are very, very stable, at least for the first three factors. The fourth factor, this working memory factor, is a little bit elusive, but it's in part because of the measures that we've put in there. And this is always the quandary between what is clinically useful and what is theoretically sound. Now, kind of empirical findings fall somewhere in the middle. But it's because of a subtest on there called arithmetic. And many of you know that arithmetic has been variously argued as being a kind of a proxy for quantitative reasoning. Others have suggested really because it's so verbally laden, it should be on verbal intelligence. Others have said, no, it really is kind of a very good measure, kind of an ecologically valid measure for working memory. And if we look here, what we find is that arithmetic is kind of the odd person out. And depending on the country you're in, it can have a double loading. It can load mainly on verbal comprehension, or it can load mainly on a kind of a working memory factor. The task of the people developing tests, of course, is to determine how they want this thing to behave, and then, of course, we can shape the test to actually measure that. But it's a very interesting factor in the sense that it kind of jumps around. Now, if we look across countries, and these are based on IRT estimates, because don't forget the tests were adapted, what we do tend to see is some country variation on the various verbal tests. We see the same thing on performance tests. And if we look at the mean IQs, the verbal performance and full-scale IQs of across the various countries, we do see some variability. Now, because you can always gaff graphs and make them look much bigger than they really are, and to know that some tests do travel a little less well, even though things show up kind of factor analytically as being okay, but you still have to standardize these tests. You still have to adjust them to whatever mean metric you want it to be. So what we've done is, we've kind of looked at these differences, and yes, the differences between subtests and the indices are significant, but when you really look at the country differences in terms of effect sizes, they're actually quite small. Really, really quite small. Using Cohen's metric and so forth, kind of an eta squared thing, what we're finding is that the differences are significant but small. What's more interesting, though, is that as we looked at these data, some things came to the forefront, and one was the differences between countries as we looked at things such as affluence and education. And when we looked at the correlation, if you wish, between the various IQ scores and affluence and education, it was pretty obvious that countries that had a much greater gross national product, were economically much more sound, and where, for example, there was a much greater emphasis on education in terms of the amount of money invested per child, the quality of schools and so forth, that these were really quite highly correlated with verbal performance and certainly full-scale intelligence. So this kind of sets the stage for what I want to talk about next. What we've been able to look at is that the factorial composition of tests such as the Wechsler are really remarkably robust and stable across countries. And we've done some follow-up studies, certainly with newer data sets, some of which I'll talk about today, WISC-4 and WACE-4, the adult scale, across countries. We've done a series of equivalent studies, and it's quite interesting as to how stable these tests are. It does show that as psychologists, we've become very, very good at the psychometric side of developing tests that can minimize much of the bias that used to be there before, and in such a way that it does minimize at least the kind of built-in bias in tests vis-a-vis those things that used to account for country differences. So whatever differences are there don't seem to be simply an artifact of having items such as who is Sacagawea. And people in the audience going, well, I don't really know. If you're an American, you probably do know. If you're not an American, unless you've studied history, no. So what we've also looked at too is that there are variations though in country scores as a function of things such as intelligence or such as education and affluence and so forth. And what it does mean though is that we can use these tests for cross-cultural comparisons. So what we want to do here for this next little bit is to take a look at some of those characteristics that do impact intelligence test scores and possibly intelligence itself in novel kinds of ways, and that's to look at some of these contextual factors. So a statement that we made in a book some time ago, in which I've already mentioned to you, is that whenever you are examining intelligence as a psychologist, whether in a hospital with a 65-year-old early dementia patient or a 7-year-old child that's moved from Spain, if you wish, to Canada, what we need to do is to take into account a whole variety of other factors besides what we simply get off the standardized administration of a test. And that includes educational, medical, cultural, family, on and on and on kinds of history. The reason for looking at this, and I'm not going to get on any kind of political bandwagon here, but there's been huge arguments in at least North America, and I'm certain in other parts of the world as well, about how these tests can be misused and abused, and actually are responsible for the disproportionate number of minorities in special education. And you know, one of the arguments is it the test, or is it just simply that these kids do have a disability, or is it because these kids have a disability relative to the mainstream culture? So one of the things that we wanted to look at is within the kind of natural laboratory of the United States standardization data is, are these group differences a result of socioeconomic status, poverty, demographic differences? Is it due to test bias? Is it simply due to group differences and so forth? So what we've done is we've taken something here called, you know, kind of the demographics of the U.S., and we've looked at the three largest groups. Now, I know none of these groups are kind of racially or even culturally pure. In fact, for anybody, especially people in Spain with a Hispanic kind of legacy, is that they would know in the United States is that Hispanics are made up of multiple groups. There's the groups that come from Mexico, Puerto Rico, groups that come from South America, and so forth. So they're anything but a kind of a homogeneous group, but probably more homogeneous in some ways than would be in comparison to African Americans. So we've taken these three broad groups, which we can kind of demographically categorize, if we wish. And the first thing we can look at is differences between these groups in terms of mental, physical health, income, and education. And just to go through this very quickly, I'm sure most of you know this, but if we control for socioeconomic status and so forth, the rates of psychological disorders really does vary across the groups. For example, African Americans are higher in all categories of mental illness compared to whites. We also know that there's higher mental illness among people who are homeless and incarcerated and in foster care. And unfortunately, African Americans are disproportionately represented in that group. And this is where we get these interactions that really, really confound the equation. We also find that African Americans don't access mental health services as often as whites. And again, it's leading to what you do when you do run into a problem. And could this be accounting for some of these differences? What we also find is in terms of physical health, for example, that African Americans have more physical health problems than either white or Hispanic groups in terms of such characteristics as infant mortality, diabetes, heart disease, and so forth. And again, there's some considerable variation, though, across the Hispanic groups as a function of, you know, again, whether Central American, Puerto Rican background, Mexican, and so forth. Income varies very, very much. It's a good proxy, if you wish, in some ways for socioeconomic status, and it does relate to IQ scores. We find that, for example, even in Canada, there's still huge debates about gender inequity in things like work discrimination, unfair pay, and so forth, but we also see this amongst these three groups in the United States. And again, it's interesting that while 17% of all U.S. children live below the poverty line, 30% of Hispanic children do, and 3 times more African American than white children live in severe poverty. And these are some issues that we then will be looking at in a wee bit. If we look at education, what we find is that there's quite some differences in college entrance rate as well as high school dropout rate. And again, as we showed in the earlier studies, education is very, very highly correlated with intelligence. Now, we know it's a reciprocity. It's not a cause and effect. It's certainly just a reciprocal kind of relationship. Parent education, once again, a great proxy for looking at the kinds of environments that we'll talk about in relation to children's cognitive development. And it certainly is parent education we've found to be one of the major variables explaining so much by way of children's cognitive development. Home influences. Again, what we've looked at here is that home environment ratings add a huge amount of information to the prediction of IQ scores from socioeconomic status. And the variance explained is often larger amongst African American and Hispanic groups than it is even for white children. So it's suggesting that there's something in the mix that we need to tease out. So I'm just going to show you a wee bit of data in a few moments. One of the things that we also need to recognize, and I'm not for a moment dismissing it, is that there's a reciprocity again between bright children and bright parents, or less bright children and less bright parents. Bright children are always presenting a challenge to parents, and parents can rise to the occasion and vice versa. So we know that. We also know that there's temperament differences. We know that there's a series of cognitive factors which we've been working on over the last while, things like motivation, volition, self-efficacy, self-concept, perfectionism, a variety of other things. So I'm not for a moment dismissing these things or ignoring them. They're part of a larger set of studies that we're doing, but simply trying to put this one in context right now. So if we look at a little bit of the data right now, what's really interesting is that based on WISC-4, now this is the most recent Wechsler Intelligence Scale for children, the full scale IQ for African Americans on average was 91.7, Hispanic 93.1, whites 103.2, and people are going, well, there you go, there's your racial differences right there. And we can see some differences, for example, in the index scores. So as we move into working memory and processing speed, the differences certainly tend to shrink across the groups. But what we do see are these particular differences. Here's some interesting kinds of things, so that get you thinking about what's going on here. If we look at the full-scale IQ of 6 to 11-year-old African American kids compared to your white group, the difference is only 6 points in full-scale IQ. For 12 to 16-year-olds, it mushrooms up to 11.8. For Hispanic kids, the difference is 1.3 IQ points when we compare Hispanic children and white children, and 8 at the 12 to 16-year level. And we can see that there's differences all the way through, that there seems to be an age factor, that at the earlier ages, much more similarity, even in spite of these demographic differences of poverty, health, and so forth. But over time, demographics really kicks in and accounts for quite a chunk of variance there. We also know, for example, again, that looking at education levels of parents for the 6 to 16-year-old groups, is that many more white parents have college education, or at least enter college, than African American or Hispanic. So if we then look at the IQ kind of thing of parents, or of children of parents who have these different education levels, what we find is that parents with education levels of less than grade 8, the average IQ within the group of children is 88. For college grads, it's 108. So, we're looking at a 20-point spread there. Also, if we kind of factor in the idea of single-parent families versus dual-parent families, and again, what's that a proxy for? Well, it's for the stability, it's for income, because you often have two working families and so forth. We begin to see that two-parent families obviously have children on average with slightly higher IQs. What's interesting is that if we look at the African American groups, they are the group that seem to have the most single-parent families, and that's why we may hypothesize that at least the lower score for single-parent families among African Americans is where it is. It's just been so kind of built into the background of African Americans. So what we've done is a series of analyses, and I'll just share these with you very, very quickly. These are all based on regression methodology recommended by Helms and so forth. And again, I won't go into a lot of detail. But if we look at race, for example, in this as a mediator between African American and white full-scale IQ, what we see is a difference of about 10.4 IQ points. Then we start to factor in, and I won't go through the detail here. If anybody's interested, I can certainly share these with you. And we then begin to bring in parent education, and income. And what we see is that this difference of 10.4 on average can drop down to about 6.3. This is even a more compelling argument. If we look at race relative to Hispanic and white children, it's a 6.3 difference. When we start to bring in parent education and income, you notice that the difference immediately shrinks to essentially 0. I mean, even measurement error is larger than 0.5 of a difference. And it's beginning to suggest to us that if we simply categorize people on the basis of some nebulous race kind of criteria, that you can have some substantial differences. At the same time, when we start to take a look at some of the fundamentals underlying some of these differences, it basically shrinks to nothing. So what I'm suggesting is, and these are general conclusions, and they're still research questions, but it's really hard to find biological or genetic markers of race. Race is certainly something also that's socially created. It's been argued by some of my colleagues, at least, that it's not a valid independent variable because group membership cannot be defined by in any scientifically acceptable kind of way. And, you know, people like Helms and others have suggested that maybe we stop looking at race as an independent variable in psychological research. But again, to the point, I think, is that race and ethnic differences in intelligence can, based on these preliminary data, can certainly be accounted for by key factors such as parent education and other proxy variables. So what I want to do is just jump ahead to one other thing and then move into a little bit of adult data. Parental expectations, if we kind of move a little bit further, it's what do parents expect of kids? And in the process, if parents expect more of kids, what do they do to support that kind of growth? As I walked through the Science Museum yesterday and I watched parents engaging their children and having and being part of the children's engagement with the kind of interactive parts of this museum, it was absolutely phenomenal to see this. But then you have to ask the question, how many other kids aren't here and why aren't they here? So again, it's one of those things that, as we've shown in many, many studies, is that when you add all sorts of new kind of stimulating things to the environment, it's one of those, the rich get richer kind of thing. That while you can change the achievement levels of children in school, for example, from very impoverished kinds of areas and so forth, that even the children who from very, very enriching kinds of areas in terms of parental education and so forth also tend to do well. They also benefit from that. So you kind of get this kind of curve rather than a kind of a merging curve. So parental expectation is certainly correlated, as we know, with education and full-scale IQ level. And again, I just wanted to throw in some of these models here, looking at parental expectation as mediators across groups and so forth. And what we find here when we look at some of these things is that parental education alone accounts for about, basically about 31% of the variance, and together with income and so forth is about 37% of the variance. But as we move down to Model 3, what we find is that parental education accounts for about 16% of the variance after controlling for education and income, and it reduces parental expectation from about 31% to about half, but the size of the parental expectation effect is still extremely meaningful. So what it means is that if we're looking to engage in a kind of an additive model, is that things such as parental expectation added in with parents who have college education and have better health and better income and can provide their kids with better opportunities, it's that expectation that also adds quite a bit to the equation. If we simply look at IQ scores, parents with low expectation of kids on average, the IQ scores in these kids are about 78, high expectations 107.4. Now we know that, again, there's an interaction and a reciprocity here. But at the same time, I mean, just these data alone probably give us a good indication that parental education and parental expectation are pretty key factors. I won't spend any more time summarizing that. I just wanted to mention then that it's the positive effects of home environments such as reading to children, computer use, limiting the goofy television that we get so much of in North America, learning opportunities, modeling learning, expectations and so forth without imposing all sorts of kind of neurotic perfectionistic expectations on kids that can explain more of the variance in children's cognitive abilities than even parental education by itself or income combined. There's some takeaway points here, obviously. Racial and ethnic differences aren't, in our estimation, due to things like test bias, but are rather due to other variables such as low socioeconomic status and so forth. And the two key points is what parents do at home seems to be more important than what they are, and demographics in and of itself is not destiny. I'm just going to jump ahead for one moment here and talk just very briefly for about 3 or 4 minutes on moving this up into the adult realm and looking at social context. Again, without reviewing all of this, if we look at differences between these three broad groups, again, which, as I say, gives us a kind of a laboratory for studying these kinds of things in the real world, is that there are differences between the three groups in education, mental health, physical health, certainly disparities in income, different opportunities, then, of course, will probably emerge for cognitive growth and development. There are differences that we've already picked up, because when we're studying children, we're actually studying their families and studying the parents, so that there are very great differences in the influences on cognitive development, not only as it works down to children, but as it works across spouses and within the adult community. And another factor, of course, that we have to look at that impacts intelligence is the individual person themselves. And again, I can't help but give a nod to Gordon Allport. So once again, as we look at the education of 16 to 19-year-olds, if we look at the dropout rates and the college entrance rates with whites, it's certainly higher than African American and Hispanic. And again, if we look at the IQ score differences, what's really interesting here is that for adults, the full-scale IQ for African American is 88.6, and for white, 103.2. And as we kind of move down the scales and so forth, what we tend to find is that this difference is maintained. Now, what's really interesting here again is that if we start to look at birth cohorts, now this is cross-sectional certainly, but if we look at the differences between 65 and 90-year-olds, African American and white, the difference is 19 points. If we look at 16-year-olds, it's 10 points. So obviously things have changed within the African American community in terms of opportunity for education and other things that probably their parents didn't have. And the history of the United States, much like the history of Canada and probably many other countries in the world, is not something at times that we really do want to celebrate. There's the beautiful side, but as we also say, the bad and the ugly side. Hispanic differences, 17.9 for the oldest age group and down to about 9.3 for the youngest. So if we look at socioeconomic mediators, and this is just for the 20 to 90-year-old group, what we tend to find here, again, is that race, if you look at it on its own, can account for about 14.8 of those differences. But as we start to bring in some of these other factors, such as education, income, so on, sex, and what have you, is that the difference drops to about 11.23. And if we do this for 16 to 19-year-olds, here's the difference here that's really interesting. Race counts will show us that there's about an 8-point difference between the groups. So it's really quite a bit lower for the young kids. What happens, though, is that when we start to introduce these other variables, these so-called demographic variables, is that the difference drops down to about 3 or 4 points. So yeah, it's getting to, it's less than a third of a standard deviation, but I can also account for that. Given even the high reliabilities of these tests, I can account for this simply by pretty much measurement error. And if we look at the Hispanic group and so forth, the difference drops from 11 to about 6. And again, for the 16 to 19-year-olds, from 11 to about 3.95. So very much the same as we found for the African-American groups. And I know because of time and the desperate need for most of us to have some caffeine ingestion, I'm just going to do a quick summary here. There's an intersection and an overlap of factors that impact the development of intelligence and cognitive processes. We know that. It's a huge intersection of genes, biology, and environment. But it includes the capability and opportunity to demonstrate these abilities, as well as include both proximal and distal resources, as well as the social norms of the world that we live in. Intelligence is certainly malleable. The work on neuroplasticity in the last number of years has certainly suggested that. So in spite of all of the age trends that we have and so forth, and we know how genetics cuts in and accounts for a huge amount of the variance with age and so forth, there's still malleability, and they're certainly within limits. And these environmental factors, will in turn, kind of mediate many of the opportunities for cognitive growth and the maintenance of cognitive abilities. Our data suggests that racial ethnic IQ differences may be decreasing with successive generations. And that, I guess, from a social perspective and kind of being a bit of a social activist in a way, this is, to me, most encouraging. Racial ethnic differences are also likely to be proxies for other key variables, such as personal factors. As we look at all of the demographics that underlie some of these differences that on the surface appear to be based on just group differences, that we can account for a lot of it simply as a function of opportunity, income, education, and so forth. We cannot stop but continue to look for personal factors that account for significant variance in intelligence. And again, I'll just simply end here and suggest that demographics are not destiny. And with that, I tell you and ask you and wish you a very, very happy conference. This is a special venue. It's a beautiful city, and we have the next 4 days to enjoy each other's company and share ideas. I'd be glad to talk to anybody about some of this work later, but I thank you very much for your time. Thank you.
This is just some practical information. There should be a coffee break right in the aisle, so feel free to go there, grab some coffee, grab some pastry, and enjoy the rest of the conference.